this is cutting out the Georgia tee front. When you fold the fabric like that, here's your fold. You want to make sure that the selvage edge is parallel to this fold. So you measure across in a couple different places. It's 13 3/4. Do the center 13 3/4, and towards the end also 13 3/4. So my selvage edge and my folded edge are parallel, the same distance apart, so that I know I'm going to cut it out on the straight grain. When you cut something out, you want to be conscious of not wasting fabric. So I have an extra piece down here. I don't really want to cut it out here if I can help it, because then I'd have a small piece here and another small piece here. So let's try to have the biggest piece available. If your pattern piece fits here, it's a better use of fabric. So I'm going to cut it out there. That arrow, this arrow, means this edge should be on the fold line. It's not on the fold line right now, but now it is. You'll notice when I cut something out, there is nothing extra around the edges. I cut out pretty much exactly with the edge of the pattern, okay? So this fabric here that I have in one big chunk, I can cut my sleeve out of that. My sleeve is 5 inches by 18 inches, so I'm going to cut 2 of those. This is the sleeve cuff piece. If you wanted to do long sleeves on this Georgia top, you can. You just take this measurement, this is going to be the same, and what you do is you're just going to cut the piece longer. You're going to cut it about 22 to 25 inches long this way, but the length or width of your sleeve is still going to be the same. The first thing we're going to do to sew this Georgia top is we're going to sew the shoulder seams together. So you're going to lay your fronts and your backs on top of each other, right sides together, pin your shoulders, and then sew them. We're using 3/8 inch seam allowance. Alright, so my shoulder seams are sewn together, 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now we have to finish the raw edge so that it doesn't unravel. I have a serger, so I'm going to run it through the serger. A zigzag stitch will work just fine here. So we're going to finish the edge and then press the seam allowance to the back of the garment. All right, now we are going to press up our hems. We have 3/4 inch hem allowance. That means the total amount of hem available for us is 3/4 of an inch. So we're gonna fold it up 1/4 of an inch first, and then we'll do 1/2 an inch. Now we're going to do 1/2 an inch. We're not going to sew it yet. This is just preparing for the future. Alright, so we've pressed up hems front and back. Now it's time for our neckline. Alright, so this is my bias tape. I made this previously. This one is 1.5 inches wide. I think that's a pretty good width to work with. You can do it with 1 1/4, but it's a little harder. You have to sew a little more precisely. So 1 1/2 inch wide bias tape. The easiest way I've found to do it is to just measure along your neckline to see how much you need, and then take off about 1 inch. So it should be 1 inch shorter than around your neckline. Okay, so first thing we're gonna do with this is press it in half lengthwise, and then we're gonna go over to the machine and sew the 2 ends together, 1/4 inch seam allowance to turn it into a circle. Alright, we have our neckline bias tape in a circle. So the next thing we're going to do is called quartering. So this seam right here, I always put that in the back. Okay, so I'm going to put a pin there. And then I'm going to fold precisely on that pin, fold and see where the other side is, directly across from it. I'm going to put a pin in there too. Okay, so I got my circle divided into half now. Now I put those 2 pins right on top of each other. I come out to this side, put a pin over here. And then I come out to this side, put a pin over here. Okay, so now my neckline is divided into quarters. Okay, now what we need to do is quarter our neckline on our garment. So if we forgot to put the little marks at center front and center back when we were cutting it out, it's okay. We know that the shoulder seams match up, right? And then we come to the very front, or this is the back actually. Go to the back, put a pin in the back. And then we're going to match up our shoulder seams again, come around to the front. Put a pin in the front. All right, now we have our neckline divided in half, right? We gotta quarter it. You're gonna think that the shoulder seams should be at the quarter, but they're really not. This distance along the back is shorter than the distance in the front. So we have to put these pins together and put the fabric out. The quarter mark is actually just a little bit in front of the shoulder seam. And we'll do it for the other side. Okay, so now our neckline is divided into quarters, okay? Now we're gonna match these up, okay? Now you gotta pay attention. What's your back, what's your front? This is my back because the neckline is higher. And I like to put this in the back, so I'm gonna match up these 2 pins and I'm gonna pin them together right there. Okay? And then I'm gonna make sure this is not twisted around. Then I'm gonna put these front pins together. Oh, and you know what I just did? I pinned this one to the right side and this one to the wrong side. So I need to switch this around. Okay. Now I'm going to put these 2 side pins together. other two side pins together. All right, so the neckline is quartered. Now remember how we did 1 inch shorter for the bias tape when we cut it out? So now the bias is a little bit shorter than the neckline, but it stretches out to match up to the garment neckline. The reason why we do the bias a little bit shorter is it helps draw in the neckline to keep it from sagging out. We want it to be nice and crisp, close. So we match them up that way. So what I usually do is I grab 2 pins, hold them, match up your raw edges, and just pull a little bit. You want to pull the bias, don't pull the garment, don't stretch that out. Just stretch out this side. Then you'll pin those together, okay? So this side, I'm gonna grab these 2 pins, match up my raw edges, and pull slightly to get them to match up. If you don't quarter your neckline and you just try to sew it around, you're gonna end up with a big bubble like that. We don't want that. It doesn't look good. So we divide the neckline and the bias up into quarters to help. Okay, great. Now we're going to sew around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? It doesn't matter where along the neckline you start. You're going to go around a circle. But you do want to make sure as you go along that the raw edges all meet up and nothing's poking out like that. So the bias is sewn with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the right side of the garment. Now we are going to press the bias and the seam allowance away from the garment. And if at any place your garment seam allowance is poking above your bias, mine is a little bit there, you can trim that down. But that's looking pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew. It's called understitch. I'm going to sew through all of these layers right there on my bias, not on my garment, on my bias, right there beside, very close to the neckline. What this is going to do is it's going to help pull, when we turn the bias in, it's going to help pull the bias to the wrong side so none will be peeking up like that. Alright, so we did our understitching. Now what we're going to do is go back to the iron and we're going to press the whole thing to the inside of the garment. This is the back of the garment because that's my seam on my bias. but it's hard to see when you're trying to get dressed in the morning. So I'm going to create a little tag using a small piece of bias, and I'm going to just stick it in here, and then I have a little tag to show me what's the back. All right, so now what we're going to do is from this side, not this side, not the front side, from the inside, we're going to go around and we're going to sew close to this edge all the way around the neckline. This is where it's really good to have thread that matches the front of your garment so that the stitching is there, but it won't be very visible. You're probably going to have to stop and rearrange your fabric as you go along. Okay, there's my top stitch neckline. Let's go press it. Okay, so when you're done, it's okay if your neckline looks a little bit wobbly and not quite straight. Just look what a good pressing can do for you. Turn on your steam. Give it a good press. Beautiful. All right, so I am doing a short sleeve top. So my next step is to sew up the side seams, right sides together. Sew up the side seams, finish the edges with a zigzag, press the seam allowance to the back. That's my job. If you happen to want long sleeves, then now is a good time to sew on your sleeve. So what you'll do is you'll open up the garment this way. So here is your sleeve edge. You're going to take your sleeve, remember it's going to be a longer piece, but it's the same width as this, and you're going to match it up from this spot over to that spot. You're going to match up the raw edges, and you're just going to sew the long sleeve onto the sleeve hole right then, okay? If you're doing a long sleeve, you sew the sleeve piece on to this space here, this armhole space. Then you're going to finish your seam, press it towards the garment, so your sleeve will be out this way. And then while it's flat, what you're going to do is press up your hem, just like we did down here, 1/4 inch and then 1/2 inch. You're going to do that to the bottom of your sleeve, and then you sew your side seams. And your side seam is going to be along the sleeve and the side. That whole thing will be your side seam if you're doing long sleeves. Right now I'm just going to sew my side seams together. So our side seam is sewn. Finish the edge with a zigzag or a serger, and then we're going to press the seam allowance toward the back of the garment. I know it's the back because my tag is right there. And I'm going to re-press up this hem so it matches up. done. Now I'm moving on to my sleeve pieces. I gotta fold the sleeve in half and press. You want to match up the raw edges as you go. Got a little uneven right there, so I'm going to straighten that out. It's better. And pressing it up wrong sides together. My fabric is the same on both sides, so you can't really tell, but we want the right side to be facing out right now. Okay, so I press these both in half, then I'm going to open it up, and just on one side, not both, just on one side, I'm going to fold it down 3/8 of an inch and press. Alright, so these are our two sleeve cuffs. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and sew up these two short edges. We're going to open up those folds and sew along there. Okay, 3/8 inch seam allowance. Alright, so I sewed it. There's no need to finish this edge because it's going to be enclosed inside the garment. It's not going to show, but we do need to press, and I am going to press the seam allowance open to try to decrease bulk along the seam, and then I'm going to repress that fold back in and this fold. And then I do think it's helpful to divide this circle into halves. So the seam is going to be one side, and then just straight across from it will be the others. So divide it into half. Alright, so we have our two sleeve bands divided into half. We're going to attach them to the garment. So for this, I'm going to take one sleeve. Here's my seam allowance. Here's my seam. I'm going to match it up to this seam. Nope, I need this one. I need right sides together. So I'm going to turn that around and match up my seams. You can kind of pinch it where you think it's right and then look inside to see. Then we'll pin that together. We're going to sew this together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then my other side I'm going to put up on this shoulder seam. I like to pin through my seam allowances so that when I sew it doesn't get flipped around to the wrong side. And then we're going to take these two pins and we're going to kind of match it up. Looks like my sleeve is a little bigger than my sleeve hole, but not much, so I can stretch it out to match it up. Alright, so now we can sew around here with 3/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to do the same thing to the other side as well. Okay, so this sleeve cuff is sewn to the sleeve in the round. I don't need to finish these edges because I'm going to cover them up. The next thing we need to do is pull the sleeve cuff out and press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. Okay, so the seam allowance is pressed towards the sleeve. Now what we do is, on this previous fold that we already ironed in, we're going to turn up the sleeve cuff, and this folded edge is going to match up or just pass the sewn seam right here. So we don't want it down here, certainly not, and not there. We want it to pretty much match up with that. And then what we're going to do, pinch it together and pin from the right side. Because what we're going to do is we're going to come along and sew right there. If you've done the pillowcase project, this is the same as attaching the band to the pillowcase. This is pinned together, so I'm pretty much going to sew right along where my pins are, right beside that edge. Alright, so I'm going to sew this band on. I'm going to pretty much sew right where I have my pins. Look at the back, make sure I didn't miss anything. I did miss a piece right here, so I can just hand sew this section together because it looks good from that side. I don't want to unpick it and do it again, so I'll just attach these by hand. And everywhere else looks good. Oh, here's another one, unless it's the same one, but I'll just do it by hand. So the cuffs are done. I did both cuffs the same way like that. And now I'm just gonna sew up that hem that we already pressed.